open, look on, no hands, look on, no frame, no shame. Numb me up like cocaine, can't focus, shaky cam. Which moment makes a man? 'Cause I'm hoping it just begins.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Robert Groves, your host for the Groves Connection podcast. The Groves Connection brings you intimate conversations with pundits, providers, patients, leaders, and laypeople, all to help us understand a contradiction. How can our healthcare system be both magnificent and yet so deeply flawed? We're going inside healthcare to talk candidly with those who know. What they have to say may delight, surprise, frustrate, or at times even anger you. But I invite you to get curious and listen to the truth about healthcare and those who want to fix it. Maybe the answers have been there all along. We just need to make the connection. Are you ready to connect? Paul Battle, welcome to the Groves Connection.
Well, thank you, Dr. Groves, again for having me. We've got to know each other a little bit over the past year or so, but it's great to be here. Thank you again.
Yeah, this is our first time meeting in person, and we are delighted to be at the AJMC studios in New Jersey for this episode. So if the sound sounds better to you, it probably is. In thinking about our relationship over the last year or two, it was only in our conversation this morning that I finally understood exactly what you and Lenovo are trying to do. But that's, before we get there, I always start way back, okay? I want to start with how you arrived, where you are today. Sure. And I start in grade school. What was your life like growing up?
So I'll start with, I was born overseas. I was born in the United Kingdom. I moved to Pittsburgh when I was young enough to not have what would have been a Birmingham accent from England. So I'd argue middle class, suburban kind of high school and grade school, et cetera. So I played sports from a very young age.
What kind of sports were you involved in? What kind of things did you enjoy?
You name it, I would play it. Soccer probably was my number one sport, just because of my parents being English and my father playing himself. But I played baseball, tennis, I skied, I played roller hockey, I played ice hockey.
I think something's lost, and there's a system that's grown up, particularly in this country. I don't know if it's the same overseas, where kids start specializing in a single sport. At a very young age, and I think that's a mistake, because the generalist approach, I think gets you a lot more exposure to a lot of different things. Were you thinking about, kids often will say, I want to be a fireman when I grow up, or a policeman, or a doctor. What is it? Did you have any ideas in your head at that?
I did. So I grew up from a pretty young age wanting to be a physician. In the beginning, it was very much generic, right? A physician of just any kind, right? Any sort of MD. And as time progressed, it became more specific. And part of this was one of my parents' close friends growing up was head of anesthesiology at UPMC. So oversaw some of probably the most renowned organ transplants. Her husband was a general practitioner, and they were somewhat instrumental in trying to say, hey, this is, why to get into it. So I went to kind of college and went through high school expecting to become a physician, a doctor.
So you were studying the sciences and all of those things, those boxes you have to check.
And admittedly was good at it, right? Math came relatively easy to me. Sciences mostly came pretty easy. I kind of understood pathways, et cetera. Gotcha. So that sort of thing kind of came pretty easy. Yeah. I was pretty good at lab work, whether it was chemistry or something else. I was, again, pretty good at stuff like that. So it became something I kind of went to Penn State, quite frankly, as fully kind of headed in that direction.
Now, this wasn't in your family. There were no physicians in your family. It was on exposure to this other doc and just a feeling you had that you wanted to go there.
I grew up with two parents who are incredible, both, entrepreneurial. Both really had their own businesses and still have their own businesses to this day. Yeah, I grew up with a little bit with that. I can kind of do whatever, which was that's great to grow up that way. That you can choose what you want to do. And one of the other interesting scenarios I would say I wanted to do was I definitely wanted to be on the research side of things as well. And this was a high school thought, right? This wasn't college thought. I wanted to be on the research side of things, help development treatment plans and other things for people kind of going forward. I didn't know what that really looked like.
Right.
And then but I knew that genetic engineering was starting to take off.
Yes.
And so I wanted to see what kind of opportunities there were going to be from a coursework perspective to talk about genetic engineering in that scenario. I kind of was pretty much narrow on that thought, and that's what I wanted to do.
So talk to us about college now. How did you make the decision? Where did you go? What did you major in?
So got into a lot of schools. Penn State gave me a scholarship, a pretty sizable one, and kind of made it an easy decision. And I did something at Penn State called biochemistry, molecular biology. I actually serve on the board of Alumni Association for Everly College of Science, which is what biochemistry, molecular biology is part of. So that's kind of another plug there, I guess, if you will. But needless to say, so I went there for biochemistry, molecular biology. And the reason I chose that was I spoke to a counselor at Penn State prior to actually getting there in the fall and said, I want to do genetic engineering. They're like, we don't have that. It's like, okay, so then tell me what I need to take to get me to that scenario. I want to eventually go to medical school, but I want to get there by way of genetic engineering. I thought that was somewhat the future of where medicine was ultimately going to go.
Yeah.
I didn't do anything specific in my first 2 years in research. It was after my sophomore year, though, that I did start an internship and did brain surgeries on rats. And we were...
that sounds to me like it might be more difficult. The tiny little brains.
It was a PhD, so it was a doctor who was focused around what in the brain ultimately creates hunger or the antithesis, you're full, and could you tweak that? My name did not get published. Some of the work I did, but my name was never on there. But I immediately enjoyed the experience from a research and
let me back up for just a second here. So you're a sophomore in college.
Correct.
That's a kid, essentially. And you are voluntarily going off and doing this internship.
Over the summer,
doing brain surgery on rats.
Yeah.
I got that right. How much time did you spend doing this? Did you do dozens? Did you do...
Oh, so it was over the summer. It was about 2.5 months, I think is what it was.
Yeah.
This is a long time ago, mind you.
Okay.
It's about 2.5 months every day. I mean, I worked, and the hours of research are not kind of, you clock in at 8:30 and clock out at 5:30. It's, you are bound by whatever the research requires you as whatever you're trying to do.
The timing has to be right, et cetera.
If you need to get back there to the location at 3 a.m. to kind of take a test of some description on the rat, you go and do that, right? That's what you go and do. And there were requirements for me to do that. I had to go in on Saturdays at 3 a.m. sometimes. I immediately became fascinated with where research and development could really take us. And this was very much the education side. So they were part of University of Pittsburgh, right?
Gotcha.
And so it wasn't the other route of research, which is pharmas and biotechs that are out there now. This was the other side of it. And then as I got into my junior year, my pathway became a little bit more focused in a couple of places. First of all, I wanted to get into something related to children, so pediatrics in some way, shape, or form. I also wanted to get into oncology. So pediatric oncology, it's a challenging topic, an incredibly challenging topic from an emotional perspective. But needless to say, I felt as though there was not enough there.
Now something must have happened along the way. I'm interested in where the inflection point came. So you're on a track. You're very clear on what you want.
Yeah.
You're headed to be an MD of some kind or a DO of some kind. And right now you're attracted to pediatric oncology, and you're moving into your junior and senior year. Tell us what happened after that.
So my senior year, take the MCATs, kind of decide, I don't want to go straight to medical school. I wanted to spend a couple of years maybe doing some additional research.
Right.
So I actually started applying jobs my senior year. I got two that I was really focused on. One was Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and thought, okay, this is a perfect opportunity for me. This is exactly kind of the direction I'm going to go. And then the second opportunity I got was for colorectal cancer at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And I'm from Pittsburgh, so in those times you have to start making the financially responsible decision, unfortunately. I couldn't make the math work in Philadelphia. I couldn't see how I would make enough money, and I chose a different path and lived at home for a couple of years and did cancer research in colorectal. That was instrumental in changing my career. And I'll explain why that is. And that individual I got, kind of the lab that I worked in was an individual by the name of Dr. J. Milburn Jessup. We'll never forget him. Amazing individual. And he was an MD. So it was rare for MDs. Nowadays it's very common. But in those days it was it was a little less common for an MD to have a lab and do as much lab work as he was
Correct.
doing,
Yeah.
as well as being fully staffed, on-call ER surgeon,
Practicing physician.
surgical oncologist, et cetera. So he was...
That's an amazing feat to pull off. I mean, that's like having
publishing-
two full-time jobs.
publishing
essentially,
very frequently.
Yeah.
I pitched for grant money to certain
right.
agencies. We'll call it a space agency of the United States.
Yeah.
So I pitched to them. So it gave me a huge opportunity, and I got published multiple times under him. So I'm
Nice, yeah.
about 7 different times. We were focused on P53, and that was, I'll leave it at that. But we were getting into some interesting conversations around, could you target specifically cancer cells using viruses? This was kind of on thought of. It
Interesting,
was a
yeah.
hugely popular thought process. So we were tagging viruses with UV and some other to get into cancer cells, and again,
Right.
you could heat up a cancer cell and then it would just blow up.
Yep.
So I realized with talking with Dr. Jessup that the world was probably going to go towards robotic surgery. Now, at this point, LASIK was kind of barely out there.
yeah. Oh.
Robotic surgery was, some direction is going to go for a couple reasons. One is, quite frankly, computers are probably just more accurate and precise than a human being. And secondly, think about remote locations where people don't have access to
Right.
gifted surgeons, and therefore, can we do it with a robot versus a human being? So,
And I have to stop you here and say, if I were a psychiatrist, I would be diagnosing you with ADHD. It's like, first I'm in genetic code, and then now I'm on to robotic surgery. That's a fairly big leap, but I get it.
Yeah.
You're fascinated with the role of insights and technology and the ability of those things to transform the way that we practice medicine or health care in this country. And so you're going down the robotics road now. So was there somebody who directed you from that genetics to robotics?
So during this time with Dr. Jessup, a couple of things. So first of all, in between my 1,000 surgeries I did on mice, I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone, I did 1,000 surgeries on mice around colorectal cancer, and ultimately the pathway between going from kind of the liver to elsewhere. Anyway, but during this, I was taking computer engineering classes. So hardware and software design. So I started learning that side of things from a technology perspective and how it could bring it back.
A little more ADHD coming in there.
A little bit, but more just learning. It's more about learning and growth, kind of saying, I don't know everything. I don't presume to know everything. And there's other ways creatively you can get to a solution. But then, so all of a sudden, I'm kind of at what I would say the peak of this, and I'm kind of like, you know what, I'm ready to maybe go to medical school. And then all of a sudden, Dr. Jessup gets moved from UPMC to University of Texas. And at this time, he asked me to drive him down, which I thought was a bit strange at the time, I'll admit. So the two of us drove, and we stopped kind of once along the way between Pittsburgh and San Antonio. And his mentor moment, he kind of said to me, he said, look, being a doctor in this country is really hard. The marketplace isn't created necessarily to help everybody fairly. It isn't created equally for a doctor to act freely.
Right.
There's a lot of guide rails and guardrails, if you will. He said to me, he's like, I think you'd be a fantastic physician, but maybe try technology. He's like, maybe you'd be better suited on that side. And he's like, you might be able to be more scalable. Think about what you could do as a singular person working for a technology company versus an individual physician.
Seeing patients one at a time. Yeah.
And so maybe that's something you try out. So I kind of course, took that to heart. And about 5 months later, I was working with his kind of peer who was in the lab. And I got myself an interview at IBM. And next thing you know, I'm kind of driving down to Atlanta, moving to Atlanta to work for IBM, and kind of everything completely changed, right? And my mindset completely changed. But Dr. Jessup was definitively... that time, he was my mentor. I didn't realize it. Right. But he was my mentor that kind of chose the pathway from that perspective.
Very interesting. Do you ever go back and think, what if I had gone on down the road to become a physician? Do you ever wonder about that?
Oh, yeah. And look, it's try having that conversation with your parents that you got into medical school. You got into medical school. You kind of got a scholarship. Almost could go for free. And, oh, by the way, I'm not. I'm going to go down to Atlanta and start from scratch at IBM, and it was it was an interesting conversation. We'll say that it completely changed, and that's why I'm where I am today versus going down the physician road.
Your first industry job, meaning the technology industry, was with IBM.
Correct.
And you stayed there for a period of time. And walk us through the next steps in your career to where you are now.
Well, first of all, the interview process was interesting with IBM. So you can visualize this: the individual looking at my resume, looking at me, looking at my resume, looking back at me, and saying, what are you doing here? Because your resume speaks like you're in the wrong place. I needed to kind of explain that. And it made sense pretty quickly why I was there. I was interested in technology. I thought I could help people. My early career at IBM was fantastic. I, again, like a sponge, learned a ton about technology across the board. That was the benefit to IBM. They were kind of everything from endpoints to big mainframe servers to services to software. But there was, of course, a hankering for me. How do I get back into really focusing on the healthcare side of things?
Because you were in every area.
Correct.
In IBM,
I was generic. There was nothing. I had some healthcare companies, but most of it was not. And I'd be sitting there in our call center like 6 o'clock at night. Most people were either had left or were leaving. And I'd be sitting there going through papers getting published. So about 3 of the papers that I was published in for colorectal cancer got published when I was at IBM.com.
Nice.
Which was, again, a dichotomy of my brain. Thinking about through...
So how did you move back into healthcare? What was that?
All right, so that's more recent. So that's... my wife and I lived in the UK for about 7 years.
Ooh, that's maybe another topic we can get to in a second. Sure. Differences between the healthcare...
Yes.
If you were there 7 years, you were there long enough to use healthcare in the
frequently.
National Health Service. But first, let's get to how did that next step happen? You were in Great Britain 7 years, you moved back.
So I moved back to the United States, and then IBM PC became Lenovo in 2005, and that's when I moved. I was living in New York City at the time, covering financial customers. And I became Lenovo. So you've
been with Lenovo since
2005. Lenovo kind of decided, hey, healthcare is not ready for you yet. Let's get you into channel. So I started building out like that side of things for several years, and then right during the pandemic, July of 2020, to be very specific.
Wow.
I got moved into back into covering what we call end users, including healthcare, and I covered health. Now I'm covering healthcare customers and every other vertical, for that matter.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Now I could kind of start to turn my attention on how to leverage technology within healthcare. Now all of a sudden, I'm like, okay, I'm finally where I kind of really wanted to be. Right in the middle of a pandemic, which is
that's an
I'd say is a
time
brick
to start
wall,
anything,
but perhaps maybe an understatement. I wanted to learn first. It's not just learning Lenovo and what we have to do with healthcare, and that's it. It's learning what's in the marketplace that's available.
I've thought about this a lot, and Lenovo is not one of those names that people go to and associate with healthcare. In fact, Lenovo's, I don't know, they don't do a lot of marketing. They're sort of under the radar. And,
a little bit,
and so when you say Lenovo and healthcare, a lot of people don't really understand what you mean by that. Now, everybody knows you serve, sell hardware. I had a Lenovo laptop at Banner Health for a long time. But, tell us, how is Lenovo going to be engaged in healthcare? What does that mean?
So I'll start with, I'm now currently on what's called our infrastructure solutions group side of the business. So that means everything from data centers to hybrid cloud to edge computing, kind of everything in between.
Now, define edge computing for us.
So edge computing, so good question. So edge means, so you have a data center that houses, in the past, right, old school methodology, houses everything, right? Houses all the information, and everything you want to do to analyze that information, it comes from the data center. It comes from a centralized location. Well, that's kind of a little bit antiquated now. Corporations, organizations did one of two things. They went up and out. So up is to the cloud, right? So up to the cloud or out to an edge, right? And like I said, sometimes both. So the point is, it's how do I put the data and the results of that data and the analytics of that data, the AI of that data, out to a place that's closer to where it's happening. Gotcha. So as opposed to a hospital group having a data center and all of it has to go from the hospital back to the data center, analyze, and then go back out to the hospital again.
Gotcha. Okay, now I'm with you. So now we're back to Lenovo.
Yeah, so what
does healthcare mean to...
Well, so our overarching mantra, if you will, was solving humanity's greatest problems. And that's everything from kind of improving wind farms to hunger to, of course, how do we prevent diseases, find cures for diseases. Now, the reason why we chose this as well is because we do have solutions that can specifically, the fastest computers on the world doing AI to kind of solve cancer, right? And do cancer research. So that's where we kind of come into this picture a little bit on one side of it.
Gotcha.
Now, specifically to healthcare, this is where it becomes a little bit different. 2 years ago, we partnered with Intel, and we said, okay, we're going to focus on the ecosystem that is healthcare. So those are the providers, the insurance companies, the pharmas, the biotechs. But now, as I mentioned, AI has absolutely taken off, and a ton of these venture capital kind of ISVs or software providers are coming out and creating software to do artificial intelligence around whatever you want within healthcare. Everything from improving prior authorization to more predictable outcomes based upon a treatment that's simulated, to collecting data about an entire patient's record and making a better determination of what they may have, right? ER aggregation. So it could be, all right, there's a ton of input of data that comes into ER. How does a nurse or physician get that in one location versus having to constantly go back and forth to the room? So all of a sudden, that's kind of where we said, all right, we need to start exploring this and building out our ecosystem. What's also important to know is you need integrators. Hypothetically, say you need a camera or you need sensors put in some.
And they all have to work together, and
So you need somebody to integrate that and implement that in wherever you're trying to get it into. Right. So we built that part of the ecosystem out as well. And all during the while, Lenovo took a huge step forward, and we call our brand name is called TrueScale, TRUSCALE, and everything can be as a service. And we do that today, right? Streaming Netflix or whatever we have. Now that's coming. What we're trying to bring that to the broader masses for technology, but more importantly, I see it as a value in healthcare.
Gotcha.
And so it's bringing all these ecosystems together, bringing this possibility to say, hey, you know what? I just want to kind of pay for it monthly. And that's kind of how it all came together.
You're making me think of something that there are a lot of different ways to manage complexity, and reductionism is one of the ways to manage that complexity. And by that I mean that you tear things apart and you see what makes them work. That's what science is. That modern science has done that for us. That perfect reductionism. This is how it works. You put these few things together. But every time you do that, you also create essentially a subspecialty. You can look at it in medicine, you can look at it in data systems, you can look at it anywhere, and you've got all these subspecialties. And it becomes more and more difficult for those subgroups to talk to each other and get the whole big picture. And so the other way of managing complexity, and Brent James did some amazing work on this, is then you have to collaborate, and you have to get all of those folks together and have them decide on a path forward. And then I think we're coming into a new era, and this has to do with AI. It is designed essentially to manage complexity, knowledge management, if you will, which is beyond human capacity anymore. Even in subspecialties, the knowledge multiplies so rapidly that it's almost impossible to keep up. To give you a quick view of how that's changed, in 1950, it took 50 years for medical knowledge to double. Now, I think it's something like 70 days. And so who can keep up with that? So one of the promises of AI, as I see it, is the ability to efficiently manage all of that knowledge and route the right pieces to the right people that are the decision makers. Is that consistent with what you're...
It is. And here's a pretty kind of alarming statistic. 90% of data is unanalyzed. 90%. So
data rich, information poor.
In businesses, other businesses, it's probably not as big a deal. In healthcare, it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
So
now you did a description on the drive up here of something that you had done in the retail segment, and
correct.
That your vision of healthcare. Let me tell you what I heard, and you tell me how far off I am. Okay. What I heard was it's kind of like Geek Squad for healthcare. What you're trying to create is the opportunity for someone to be able to say, look, I want a smart room for my patients because I need that. I have to be able to be more efficient in my business, and I want a smart room. And today, what they might have to do is talk to a server company. They're talking to a camera company. They're talking to an AI company. And what you're saying is, look, we can help you integrate all of that and implement it at scale and show you what the ROI is on that implementation. Is that kind of the notion?
Totally correct. So we started that out in retail. I'm not going to go into too much of the specifics there. because it's not as relevant. The point is we executed it within the retail space with some ISVs, camera manufacturers, the services, et cetera. And it's everything from shrink, and shrink is a term used in retail about loss, whether it's by theft or by point of self-checkout loss. A big issue across both the retail and healthcare is employee retention. And so there are tools now that you can use AI. Is the person effective? And are they, and if not, can we improve their effectiveness, therefore to make maybe their job is more kind of important to them and they feel more valued, et cetera. I don't think any employee values going and changing the pricing on shelves, right, in a retail location, right?
Probably not.
I suspect similarly in healthcare, there's a ton of administrative tasks.
Right.
If you could automate that or even move to the point where it's AI, we're turning it now over to healthcare. We're using the same kind of scenarios that we execute in retail to try and do the same thing in healthcare. Look, I've read multiple articles in regards to employee retention within healthcare. I mean, nurse shortages, physician shortages.
Burnout.
Exactly, burnout. So these are definitive. And I think it's a twofold. It's the pandemic took its toll on people mentally. But in addition, the specialty, everybody's so hyper specialized now. You realize, okay, I'm really thin at this particular specialty. How can we make them more effective? Want to be there longer and feel more valued.
So this brings up lots of other issues.
Yeah.
I mean, it conceptually it makes such good sense that having a turnkey solution for an operator of a large, complex business that leverages AI optimally, that has the right instruments in the right places to deliver the information, all makes sense. We've had a lot of talk lately about the bias that can be built into AI systems. For example, if you teach a computer vision system to recognize skin cancer, but 90% of the patients are Caucasian, then you may have missed an opportunity to make that diagnosis in darker skins. And so if you put that on the market, it is going to automatically discriminate. How do we make sure that the AI systems are trained properly? That may not be your area of expertise, but that's an area that's of concern.
Yeah. First, I'll start by saying it's not my area of expertise, but my opinion would be you have to feed it as much diverse information as possible, period. To your point, yes, if you don't have a balance, and skin cancer is a great example, you're going to have a one-directional outcome, which will work, by the way, on that one particular
subpopulation.
But
sure.
How helpful it really is.
When I think about the role of AI, I worry that we will remake it in our own image. And that really is the problem, isn't it? It's saying, if you remake it, for example, I'm a little bit bothered by the fact that ChatGPT is trained on the internet. Have you seen some of the stuff that's out there? And, I wonder if it's going to take effort for us to train AI in a way that makes it ethical, egalitarian, that makes it appropriate for use. And I think we're just starting to learn how to do that. And so there is some hesitancy for broad implementation. And I think there's some reason to be hesitant. But can we overcome those barriers? Is it possible for us to get past that?
So we work with several companies to properly machine learn, getting the data, getting the information, right? Hence the collaboration and kind of that data collaboration is a necessity. So we have to build that as our foundation, that we can't be singular in our country and location. Look, when I was doing research, we did a lot of things in Italy, right? We shouldn't be operating in a subpopulation vacuum, I'll call it. And so we should be making decisions for the kind of the holistic population.
Gotcha. That's obviously not the only barrier. And the other one that comes to mind, again, great conversation on the way up here. You mentioned that, we've got all of it. And frankly, I know a lot of the technology, for prior authorization, we can flip the model today to clinical decision support up front and do away with, 80, 90% of all the hoopla. We know we can do that today, but it's not done. And one of the reasons, I think, is because, as they say, the basics aren't in place. So describe what you mean by the basics. Hospital systems tend to have antiquated, relatively speaking, systems. And describe to us that problem.
So let's take a step back for a second. Let's talk prior authorization and why it, in my opinion, is one of the biggest challenges we have in the U.S. at the moment with healthcare. It's ultimately the request to do something, whether it's a scan or a treatment that's revolutionary and it's just been approved by the FDA. It's getting them approved by an insurance company. It's nothing that's essentially what it is. and the process that is very manual, in my opinion, incredibly manual.
Yes.
I'd argue bias, and it takes a long time. And I believe there's a sweat out scenario, meaning, okay, I know if I make you wait, 6 weeks, you're probably going to forget about it and not want it. Happened to me personally, and a particular thing.
It sounds like a personal experience.
But this is a real life scenario of prior authorization and how technology and what can be saved, is mostly preventative, right? Preventative is the best medicine, right? How to prevent something from happening. And so some of what, people want to get done is preventative, and yet they don't see it that way.
Yep.
Because it just seems like, okay, here's the cost, and that's just too much at the moment. So prior authorization became a very, in my opinion, important place to focus AI and to try and improve. And it ultimately gives back to the fact it gives more healthcare to more people. More quickly, more efficiently, more effectively. And the downstream effect of this benefit is across the board, right? The patient outcomes are more effective in the grand scheme of things, and we're getting quicker. It's going to be beneficial to the hospital systems because they're getting a quick kind of response. They're able to move quickly. They become ultimately more efficient.
Right.
And overall, it will benefit insurance companies because they're mostly doing preventative care as opposed to the incredibly costly downstream. So there's an impressive amount of reasoning, but also they waste a ton of overhead on the process.
Absolutely. It is an expensive process for insurance companies as well.
So there's a savings across that side. So I think it's a win-win-win for all of the different kind of parties if you can start to improve.
I absolutely agree with that. And the only thing that I want to say to sort of balance the scenario, and I feel compelled to, is that with regards to physician practice, there's a lot of variability. There's a huge amount of variability. And with regards to even the quality of like MRI interpretation, huge amount of variability, and they can't all be right. Mm-hmm. And so having some way to help, this is again the Brent James model, to come together and all of us decide together what is best practice, what is experimental, what's no longer experimental, and how do we pay for it instead of the games that tend to happen in trying to slow delivery system excess on one side and control costs through that blunt instrument versus the pushback from the other side, and ultimately leading to legislation that can make things worse instead of better. So it is a complex problem, but AI, as you point out, can solve it for all of those folks, and it is in the service of patients. They're getting what they need and not more than what they need. And that's why I want to, I say flip the model to upfront clinical decision support. Right. No doctor can keep up with all the evidence, and clinical decision support makes perfect sense. Right. Gosh, I want it if I'm a physician. I want to know how to practice at the top of my game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. To be clear about AI, it's not self-guided. Yes. Meaning the machine is not teaching itself what to decide.
Right.
You have to, as you alluded to early, it's about feeding it the proper information.
Right.
So imagine you mentioned feeding it with scans, right? I mean, let's use a simple one, like a chest X-ray. So you do a chest X-ray across the world, right? It theoretically, get it from across the world.
Right.
Everything's diverse.
Yes.
So that's the first thing. But the second thing now is this: can you incorporate cutting edge technology and information into the machine learning? Can you start plugging in papers and things that are being done, and it can read through it and I understand what that means. How can I apply that to anything? And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely it can. Now we have generative AI, ChatGPT and other things. We have generative AI. It absolutely can digest and give answers based upon the kind of holistic view. So you can have that ability to learn what the cutting edge treatments are out there. Yes. Right. And it could literally spit out and say, okay, this patient should, look into this cutting edge treatment, and here's where it is in the cycle. It's not fully FDA approved. It's in clinical trials, or it's in trials at a hospital, or whatever it may be. Or here's your other options. It absolutely can do that if the information it's fed is now. The challenge we're running now today with ChatGPT is it's unlimited. There's no filter to it. People can put in real information, but they can also put in fake information. Yes. So it's how do you make sure that the information that's being fed into the model, into the machine learning model, is real. You can bias it with incorrect information. That's happening today with ChatGPT, right? But how do you do that? How do you make sure in a world of healthcare, how do we make sure that the information that it's being fed is regulated in some way, shape, or form?
This is such a fascinating time to be in healthcare and a fascinating time to be in AI and technology in general.
Yeah.
And there's no paucity of challenges. There are tremendous challenges, but the opportunity is still, I think, incredibly attractive. And we ought to move cautiously, but we ought to move aggressively towards managing complexity with AI. Because if we don't, the system's going to collapse under the weight of its own complexity if we're not able to do that.
We're bordering that. We're bordering that scenario where healthcare system in the United States maybe is close to that, right? As I mentioned, employee retention, burnout, all those sorts of things are real. So there isn't enough technology. So let's talk about this. There are thousands upon thousands of companies to work with in the healthcare ecosystem. Thousands.
Yes, literally.
Right.
Yeah.
How do you prioritize, right? So it's all about, okay, it's great. We want to move quickly. How do I choose the top 20? How does Lenovo choose the top 20, right? And there's some criteria that we have in regards to the ability to make a difference, but how quickly can it be a difference?
Gotcha.
Like how much is really involved with getting it to market and doing a proof of concept, getting it proven by a healthcare organization or insurance or whoever. Prior authorization became a pretty simple check mark, like, yes, we want to go hyper aggressive after prior authorization. We're not trying to boil the ocean.
Right.
We do want to create a marketplace that is accessible to a lot of these providers like ISVs or IoT providers like sensors. But at the same time, we're still going to have a hyper focus on probably like a top 20 in this area.
Okay. I didn't understand how much power AI uses. We're talking about the electric grid, and it's a time of environmental sensitivity. And, what can be... Is it inevitable that it's just going to, I think about cryptocurrency and the massive amounts of power used to generate those trusted systems. How do we get past that? What's the next step in the evolution of that strategy?
Yeah, so that's part of Lenovo's viewpoint as well, right? So we made an incredibly bold statement that we are going to be net zero by 2050 as a company, which is an incredibly bold statement. The second thing is from an ESG perspective, environmental we'll start with. From an environmental perspective, we are helping customers fulfill their environmental kind of regulations they put on themselves or their commitments that they have as a corporation, right? And so...
Because hospitals are big offenders. Huge
absolutely.
offenders.
So how do I help them, right? So we several years ago we launched something called, and the brand name is called Neptune. So Neptune warm water cooled. So AI is, we talked about early on, is done both in a data center and at the edge. Okay, so let's talk data center first. So within a data center, there's traditional way of cooling is via fans. It's nothing terribly more complicated than that. You have raised floors, you have fanning and air kind of going through it, and it's pretty cold if you've ever gone to a data center, unless you're right behind the rack, which then there's heat coming out, but fundamentally using fans. So how do we change that? And here's also the issue. We're getting to a point where you can't cool, and therefore they won't perform at their top level. So warm water cooling was born. Neptune warm water cooling is our brand name for it. And this is ultimately funneling water or room temperature water through the components that are mostly getting hot, which is the processor, the memory, the GPUs, etc. We funnel the water past it to cool it down.
You're providing a heat sink.
Because over here is a 100-degree processor, and over here is a room temperature kind of lower, and it cools it.
So it's more specificity in terms of what you're cooling, and water makes the most sense to get to those areas.
And Lenovo was just actually, we have a footprint of a supercomputer in the New York tri-state area that was named the greenest supercomputer, which is now again. So to your point about kind of power consumption in AI. So AIs use GPUs, require GPUs ultimately, and a lot of processing power typically. So therefore, power consumption.
Right.
Now we believe we can get to a point where we can lower the power requirements and from a cooling perspective. innovations continue throughout as we try to improve this. But absolutely, it's top of mind.
First of all, it's good to know that there are smart people thinking about these things and creating
to
solutions.
To be clear, that is not me. Let's get that out of the way. That is my peers and colleagues who are incredibly gifted in kind of really making this world a better place from that perspective. So yes, that's not me. I don't presume to be that expert.
So I've got one last topic for you, and then we'll wrap it up. You lived in Great Britain for 7 years, experienced the National Health Service.
Correct.
Compare and contrast the system here with the system there, and what do you see as the biggest opportunities for our system, given that context?
Yeah, I'll tell a story first. So first of all, you should know. So there's nationalized healthcare. You can walk into any hospital, clinic, whatever in the United Kingdom. Even if you're a traveler, by the way, and you will get treated, period, right? So the system's built upon a financial tax systems on gasoline, on cigarettes, on other things to kind of help fund it, plus, of course, income taxes. But ultimately, you can get treatment no matter what. With that said, there is private within the United Kingdom. You might say, okay, what does private do in a nationalized health system?
Right.
Example is, friend of mine, he's out doing an ATV. We can argue whether he should have been on an ATV or not, but that's another conversation for another time. He unfortunately makes a turn too quickly, goes flying off of it, breaks his arm. He's off in the no man's land in Turkey, outside of Istanbul. Gets flown back to London, goes to see a specialist to get a surgery, and they're like, okay, it's going to be about 4 to 6 weeks to get your surgery scheduled. This is a person who's got a broken arm, probably he has rods. He's broken in about 8-9 different places. And he's got other issues, right? He's got to wait 4 to 6 weeks.
Ooh.
That's what they tell him, right? Nationalized healthcare.
Yeah.
You're in a waiting list, right? So there's a queue system, as the Brits like to say.
Yes.
All of a sudden he goes, I work for, I'm not going to say who works for, I have private healthcare.
Gotcha.
Oh, which one do you have? Oh, this. Oh, okay. I'll schedule you next week.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So be careful about this broad-based assumption that the world is like Pollyanna over in the United Kingdom. It is a great system. It treats everyone, but there are still some challenges that they have that we need to learn from as well, right? So there's a balancing act that we need to do. Now, look, I've not seen lately, but there's also percentages on research and development in the countries. Now, the United States is a lot bigger country, GDP-wise, than the United Kingdom. But comparatively, again, there's more research and development that comes out of the United States for healthcare than any other country per capita on Earth, bar none.
True.
And is that a result of the blindingly high costs that we have? I don't know. I'm sure an economist could prove that, but I'm not one. But the point of the matter is, the system is fantastic in the United Kingdom for what it needs to be done, which is treat everyone.
Right.
Doesn't say treat everyone well. It just says treat everyone.
Make sure everybody gets treatment.
So that's the balancing act that is kind of how do you get everyone treated, but everybody treated well with the best possible outcomes. That is the balancing act between our two systems.
Yeah, it is a bright future for sure if we
Agreed.
If we take the right paths, and I'm excited about that. I think there's a lot to look forward to.
Agreed.
Any last thoughts that you have on healthcare or your career or where Lenovo's going that you'd like to get in?
A couple of things. So thank you again for the time this afternoon. This was fantastic. The future is bright. Healthcare future absolutely is bright. I kind of made it seem a little doom and gloom during this maybe, but the future is absolutely bright because there are a lot of intelligent people working on this problem that is how to really make patient outcomes. I actually have a kind of a briefing next week on the West Coast about patient next in this touchless patient room. The future is bright. We have to figure out a way to harness the technology that is out there to really drive towards better patient outcomes. That's what we're at Lenovo trying to do. And you can see the other parts of it. The ancillary, hey, how do we make sure we're environmentally responsible? ESG, of course, is social responsibility as well. Yes. So how do we make this all responsible? So we talked a little bit about kind of health equity and so on. So how do we make sure that everyone has access to it? Imagine a touchless patient room in the middle of nowhere in a rural area where they're an hour and a half from something. Talk about my early days of doing robotic surgery and making that available to someone, again, in a rural area or in an area of the world that they don't have access to that. How do we get there? As I mentioned, the epiphany is this. it's not just treating everyone. It's treating everyone with the best possible outcomes.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
where, and I know we're heading in that
That's
direction.
the holy grail.
I know we're heading in that right direction. Now it's time to harness what we have out there and accelerate.
Wow, that was a tour de force of technology in healthcare. I've learned so much this morning, both
Ditto.
on the drive up and during the session.
Ditto,
so
by the way.
I just want to thank you so much, Paul, for being so generous with your time. I want to thank AJMC for loaning me their studio. It's been a lot of fun, and that will be it for the Groves Connection for this episode. And join us next time on the Groves Connection. Paul Battle, so long.
All right, thanks again.
You've been listening to The Groves Connection, your connection to the inside story on healthcare, featuring in-depth interviews with those who know. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, give us a 5-star review to keep the connection going, and hit the subscribe button to be sure you never miss a beat. The Groves Connection is produced by Dr. Robert Groves. Original music, editing, and creative direction provided by Alden Groves. Production support, content guidance, courtesy of Janae Sharp and Elizabeth Barrett. Thank you for listening. The professional ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and do not reflect those of any current or past employers. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time on the Groves Connection.